Well, the polls are open in the US state of South Carolina for the Democratic primary, or for its Democratic primary. President Joe Biden is expected to win, despite Representative Dean Phillips and author Marianne Williamson being on the ballot.
This is an early test for President Biden with perhaps the most loyal constituency in the Democratic Party, black voters. And, after traveling the state this week and speaking with black voters, I would say that the reviews are really mixed. You have some, particularly low-income folks, working-class folks with real economic anxieties who say that their lives have not gotten any materially better, even though that they routinely vote for Democrats. You have others that are excited about President Biden. They still give him a lot of credibility for being former President Barack Obama's vice president. And then others who take a more pragmatic approach, who are really afraid of the prospect of former President Trump returning to the White House. And they say that they don't think about elections in 4 and 8 year cycles, but really think about the long-term implications for our country, and that's why they're going to support President Biden. Take a listen to a little bit of what these voters told us.
We need a candidate who's going to stand up strong for us, or we're voting for the couch.
So South Carolina Democrats, 60% of whom are black, they brought President Biden's campaign back to life in 2020. That is why he fought so hard for this state to hold the first in the nation primary. And when I spoke to Democratic National Committee Chair Jamie Harrison this week, he said that they're not only going to be running against Trump, they're also going to be making an affirmative case for President Biden, talking about how they lowered the cost of insulin, student loan forgiveness, as well as a number of other issues.
Well, let's head straight to the United States, and joining me is US political analyst and commentator Aidan Smith. Aidan, you just heard that story, of course, Joe Biden. What did you make of it?
Hi, so great to be back on here as always. And yeah, I think that the South Carolina primary, well, there's really no doubt that Biden will come out definitively on top against his opponents. The margin is what we're really looking at here. If it looks like a weaker than expected margin, I think that that will cause a lot of commentators to question their own assumptions about whether Biden really has the full strength of the Democratic base at the level in which he needs, obviously, going into November, should the margin be fairly narrow.
It is very difficult to follow the polls, particularly when you're talking about the election in November. You can start an article and the first half will tell you that Joe Biden is 8 points ahead. The second half of the article will tell you that Donald Trump is ahead. As someone that lives and breathes this, Aidan, how do you get through the polls?
Obviously, yeah, I think that is the natural response to this. I think since 2016, which, 8 years ago, as crazy that is to say, since it seems more recent, 2016, the polling failure that ultimately didn't account for Trump's victory, we've had a variety of polling firms rapidly adjust their models, sometimes in ways that oversample certain groups, try to account for in polls that show lower levels of Trump support. They'll account for the possibility of what we'd call shy Trump voters, people saying that they're ambivalent or neutral, but will ultimately vote Republican in the polls. I think the main thing to look at is the state polls, because until now in November, we'll probably see a lot of noise in terms of who's coming out on top nationally. And I think just looking at the trend lines in the main states, since it's an electoral college, looking at what happens in Nevada, which, to be fair, is a difficult state to poll for a variety of reasons, more so than most. But yeah, I think the general sentiment is just to pay attention to movement in the most key states, Georgia, Arizona, what have you, to really get a sense of where it's likely to head.
What are you making of what you're seeing at state level?
I think right now, I think that for the first time, Trump has been an unofficial candidate for 2024 since pretty much the day he left office, and obviously announced officially in November of 2022. But for most of this, what we've seen is that Americans are only really now grasping the fact that it is going to be a Trump versus Biden rematch, which, national polling as recently as a month ago, most Americans were in disbelief about, even though that was kind of the inevitable conclusion. So I think on a state-to-state basis, we're really seeing people wake up to this, meaning that obviously higher support for Trump among people who supported his presidency, but may have been answering undecided before this because they weren't sure he was going to be the nominee. And then higher support among Biden, among people who probably voted for him last time, aren't super satisfied with his presidency, but don't want to see a return of Trump to the White House. So I think the main thing we're seeing is pure polarization really ramping up in the lead up to November.
Is anyone ahead in your eyes?
If the election was held today, I'd personally wager that Trump would come out on top. I think that he would probably win states like Georgia, which he lost last time by a narrow margin. I think the main thing looking forward, and I probably almost sound like a broken record on this because this is my general opinion on where things will head. But in a really polarized country, the main thing that's going to matter is the last 2 months of the campaign, and really not having anything to do with how the candidates themselves campaign, but more so just like general macroeconomic trends. If we see like spikes in gas prices or health insurance premiums, that will look badly for Biden and will probably lead Trump to get out on top. If inflation eases and the economic circumstances look better in November, I think that probably would cause Biden to have an edge overall. But as it stands, I think Trump is probably the favorite.
Well, if you look at it economically, and I know we're a fair way from November, but recent figures from the United States where inflation is around that 3 mark, there was pressure for rates to drop. They haven't done it, but it looks like it will happen. The economic balls may just fall in the government's direction later on in the year.
Yeah, I actually agree with this. And I think that, in 2022, the economic outlook did look pretty bad for most Americans, even though there were good indicators. But for the most part, since people are very sensitive to things like gas prices and inflation, core inflation anyway, that looked really bad for the Democrats in 2022. And it was ultimately the division around the abortion issue that ultimately led to Democrats in their favor and allowed the 2022 to be closer than a lot of people thought. Going into 2024 with core inflation easing, I think that, that does stand to benefit Biden. The main thing is, obviously huge geopolitical turmoil, which in addition to massive humanitarian consequences, the main issue of it also obviously has huge economic ramifications as well. So something along the lines of, in terms of international consequences akin to the Ukraine-Russia war, the current war in Gaza, breaks out later in, September, October, that could cause huge impact to global markets and ultimately lead to the kind of chaos that obviously no one, but definitely Biden does not want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's certainly some powder kegs internationally. Just finally, Michelle Obama, this story sort of got a little bit of groundswell during the week. The talk that she may replace Joe Biden, it's probably his greatest negative. He's 81 years of age, but he's not a fit, strong, robust, mobile 81.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle Obama is someone who probably for the past decade or so, people have been on the Democratic side. A lot of people have been wanting to see her run for office. She's usually in polling named one of America's most admired people. She herself has always just seemed very resistant to running for office, even someone obviously with a huge career in private practice as an attorney, but ultimately never chose to run for office in the 2000s and hasn't really ever indicated interest since Barack Obama left the White House. But I think for, decades to come, just given her personal strengths, I think a lot of Democrats would love to see her someday decide to switch goals. But for, I think, this primary, things are pretty much set in place for, too late for anyone to enter the race, whether it would be someone as unconventional a candidate as Michelle Obama or otherwise. So I think Biden basically does have the primary locked up.
Yep. Aidan, we'll talk again soon.